"Then let her father walk through that door," Richard Hawthorne said, his voice echoing beneath the crystal chandeliers. "Until that happens, this wedding isn't happening." The music stopped so suddenly that the silence seemed louder than the string quartet had been only a heartbeat earlier. Every conversation inside the Hawthorne Grand Ballroom faded into nervous whispers as more than 300 guests turned toward the center of the room. Waiters froze with silver trays balanced in careful hands. Camera flashes blinked once, then disappeared. Even the fountain outside the towering windows seemed quieter beneath the heavy evening sky. Ethan Hawthorne stood beside the woman he loved, his jaw tightening as he looked from his father to Naomi Brooks. She was breathtaking in a simple ivory dress that reflected none of the extravagant wealth surrounding her. A delicate bracelet with tiny blue beads rested around her wrist, the only piece of jewelry she had refused to replace. She gently touched it with her fingertips, almost as if reminding herself of something far more valuable than diamonds. Richard straightened the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo before slowly raising his glass. "The Hawthorne name has taken generations to build," he continued. "Legacy matters. Family matters. And before my son marries into another family, I deserve to know the man who raised his future wife." Several guests nodded quietly. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had all heard the rumors. The bride's father had never attended public events. No photographs existed in magazines. No business profiles appeared online. Some believed he had abandoned his family years ago. Others whispered he worked odd jobs somewhere in the Midwest. The uncertainty had become tonight's favorite conversation. Naomi remained perfectly still. Her warm brown eyes never left Richard, yet there was no anger inside them. Only calm. The kind of calm that made people wonder whether she understood something they did not. Ethan reached for her hand. She squeezed his fingers gently before letting go, silently asking him not to interrupt. Richard noticed the gesture and gave a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "This family welcomes honesty," he said. "If your father cannot be here today, perhaps there's a reason." A ripple of uneasy laughter drifted through one corner of the ballroom before quickly fading. Naomi inhaled slowly. "My father always keeps his promises," she answered softly. Her voice was quiet, but every guest heard it. If he said he would come, he'll come. Richard glanced toward the enormous entrance doors and checked the gold watch resting beneath his sleeve. "The ceremony begins in 20 minutes, he replied. "Time has a way of revealing the truth." Outside, rain tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking the circular driveway. Luxury cars lined the entrance beneath glowing lights, each arrival announced by smiling attendants in black suits. Inside, the orchestra cautiously resumed a slow melody, though no one returned to their conversations. Every eye drifted back to the entrance every few seconds. Reporters whispered into microphones. Family friends refreshed social media feeds. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, an elderly housekeeper named Margaret quietly watched Naomi instead of the doors. She had seen courage before. It rarely looked loud. It almost always looked exactly like this. Naomi lowered her eyes to the little blue bracelet again. Her mother had once fastened it around her wrist and smiled. "People will always tell you to prove who you are," she had said. "Never forget that character speaks long before introductions do." Naomi smiled to herself as the massive entrance doors remained closed. Across the room, Richard believed he had already won. He had no idea that every passing second was bringing the one man he least expected closer to changing every life inside that ballroom. The soft melody drifting through the ballroom no longer sounded like music. It sounded like a clock counting down. Every glance toward the towering entrance doors seemed longer than the last, and every passing minute deepened the quiet tension hanging over the celebration. Ethan stepped closer to Naomi until their shoulders nearly touched. He lowered his voice so only she could hear. "We can leave right now. We do not have to stay here." Naomi looked at him with a gentle smile that somehow carried more confidence than fear. "Running away would only prove that your father is right about something he does not understand." Ethan searched her face for doubt, but found none. He had fallen in love with her because she never tried to impress anyone, and tonight she was exactly the same woman he had met 2 years earlier at a neighborhood literacy fundraiser. Richard remained near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by longtime business partners who quietly assured him that he was protecting the family legacy. One executive leaned closer and whispered, "People notice these things. Reputation is everything." Richard answered with a slow nod, convinced he was acting out of responsibility rather than pride. Across the room, Margaret Ellis watched him with sadness instead of agreement. She had worked for the Hawthorne family for more than 30 years and had learned that the loudest confidence often hid the deepest insecurity. A young reporter adjusted her microphone and quietly spoke into the camera. Guests are still waiting after unexpected comments from the groom's father. The identity of the bride's father remains unknown, adding even more mystery to an already unforgettable evening. Within minutes, phones throughout the ballroom lit up with headlines and speculation. Some guessed Naomi came from a struggling family. Others invented stories about unpaid debts or broken relationships. The rumors multiplied faster than anyone could correct them. Naomi never looked at a single screen. Instead, she walked toward the refreshment table and accepted a simple glass of water from one of the servers. She thanked him by name after reading the small badge on his jacket. The young man smiled with visible surprise. It was perhaps the first time that evening someone had spoken to him as though he truly mattered. Margaret noticed. So did several guests standing nearby. Small moments often revealed more about a person than grand speeches ever could. Richard watched Naomi from across the ballroom. He had expected tears, excuses, or frustration. Her calm unsettled him far more than any argument would have. "She is remarkably composed," one guest quietly observed. Richard folded his arms. "Confidence is easy when there is nothing left to lose." Margaret overheard the remark and gently shook her head. She whispered almost to herself, "Sometimes confidence comes from knowing the truth has its own schedule." Outside, the rain began to slow, leaving tiny drops shimmering beneath the estate lights. Valets continued opening doors as elegant cars arrived one after another, yet none carried the guest everyone was waiting to see. Ethan checked his watch before looking toward Naomi again. She was lightly touching the blue bracelet on her wrist, exactly as she had done earlier. He remembered asking about it during their first date. She had smiled and simply said, "It reminds me that real wealth cannot be inherited. It has to be lived." At the time, he thought it was only a beautiful sentence. Tonight, he began to understand that it was the foundation of everything she believed. Then, somewhere beyond the grand entrance, the low sound of an engine rolled across the quiet driveway. It was not the smooth hum of another luxury sedan. It was older, slower, almost ordinary. Inside the ballroom, no one knew that the evening had just begun to change. The unfamiliar engine came to a gentle stop beneath the covered entrance, and several guests instinctively turned toward the windows. A weathered blue pickup truck rested between rows of polished luxury vehicles as if it had wandered into the wrong world by mistake. Rainwater still clung to its hood, reflecting the warm lights of the estate. One of the younger valets hesitated before approaching the driver's door, uncertain whether the visitor had taken a wrong turn. The door opened slowly, and a tall man in his early 60s stepped onto the stone driveway. He wore a dark brown jacket that had clearly been repaired more than once, clean work boots, and a neatly pressed white shirt with no expensive labels. His silver hair was trimmed carefully, and although his clothes were simple, there was nothing careless about the way he carried himself. He thanked the valet with an easy smile before reaching into the truck and retrieving a small gift box. Wrapped in plain navy paper, there were no security escorts, no photographers rushing forward, and no assistants carrying briefcases behind him. He looked like an ordinary American father arriving late to his daughter's wedding. Inside the ballroom, the guests continued whispering as the entrance doors remained closed. Richard glanced at his watch again and shook his head almost imperceptibly. If he intended to be here, he quietly remarked to a business associate, he would have arrived long before now. The associate nodded politely, although his attention drifted toward the front entrance. Ethan heard his father's comment, but chose not to respond. Instead, he looked at Naomi, whose eyes had brightened for the first time all evening. She had not moved from her place beside the ballroom windows, yet something inside her seemed lighter, almost peaceful. Margaret noticed the subtle change and smiled to herself. She had seen that expression only once before, years earlier, when a military father surprised his daughter by returning home for Christmas after months overseas. It was the smile of someone who no longer needed to worry. Outside, The man paused before climbing the wide staircase leading toward the entrance. He looked up at the grand building, took one slow breath, and lightly brushed a raindrop from the small gift box. A young employee hurried over to offer an umbrella. "Thank you," the man said warmly. "You should stay dry too." He gently positioned the umbrella so they both stood beneath it while walking toward the doors. The employee blinked with quiet surprise. Very few guests ever thought to share comfort with the staff. As they reached the entrance, another attendant opened one of the heavy doors. "Welcome, sir. May I have your name?" The man smiled politely. "Daniel Brooks. I believe my daughter has been waiting for me." The attendant nodded without recognizing the name and stepped aside. At that exact moment, across the ballroom, Naomi slowly closed her eyes for just an instant before opening them again. Ethan followed her gaze toward the entrance. Richard folded his arms, fully expecting an awkward introduction that would confirm every assumption he had already made. None of them noticed that, only seconds after Daniel crossed the threshold, 3 guests seated at separate tables had suddenly stopped their conversations at exactly the same time. Their expressions changed from casual interest to unmistakable recognition as they quietly rose to their feet. Daniel Brooks stepped inside without the slightest hint that every eye in the ballroom would soon be fixed on him. He paused just beyond the entrance to gently close the umbrella before handing it back to the attendant with a sincere smile. "Thank you for keeping us both dry," he said. The young man nodded, unexpectedly touched by the simple kindness. Daniel adjusted the plain navy gift box beneath his arm and quietly looked across the room until his eyes found Naomi. For a brief moment the noise, the lights, and the crowd disappeared. Father and daughter smiled at each other with the familiar warmth that only years of unwavering trust could create. Naomi lifted her hand slightly, the blue bracelet catching the glow from the crystal chandeliers. Daniel answered with a nearly invisible nod, as though they had just finished a conversation that required no words at all. Richard noticed the exchange and let out a slow breath. The man standing before him looked nothing like the image he associated with influence or success. There were no custom-tailored suits, no security detail, no luxury watch gleaming beneath the ballroom lights. Richard quietly concluded that everything he had assumed about Naomi's family had been correct. Ethan, however, watched Daniel differently. He saw the confidence in the older man's posture, the relaxed expression on his face, and the way he acknowledged every employee he passed with the same respect he offered the guests. There was something quietly remarkable about him, even if Ethan could not explain why. Before Daniel could take another step, an elderly gentleman seated near the front slowly rose from his chair. His wife looked at him with surprise. "Harold," she whispered. Harold ignored the question. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel as though he had just recognized someone he had not expected to see anywhere, let alone at a wedding. Across the ballroom another guest, a distinguished woman with silver hair and an elegant emerald dress, also stood. She placed her champagne glass on a nearby table without taking her eyes off Daniel. Moments later a third guest, a respected attorney from Chicago, quietly straightened his jacket and began walking toward the entrance with an expression of genuine admiration. The movement spread subtle confusion throughout the room. Conversations stopped once again. Several reporters lowered their cameras, unsure why 3 accomplished professionals were suddenly leaving their tables to greet a man who appeared to have arrived in an aging pickup truck. Richard frowned. "Do they know him?" one executive whispered. "Perhaps from church," another guessed. Margaret noticed the growing curiosity and folded her hands together with a faint smile. She did not know Daniel personally, yet she recognized a familiar pattern. Truly respected people often entered rooms without announcing themselves. Their reputation arrived first, carried quietly by the people whose lives they had already changed. Daniel seemed completely unaware of the attention gathering around him. He simply continued walking toward Naomi at an unhurried pace, his weathered boots making soft sounds across the polished marble floor. The small gift box never left his hand. His expression remained peaceful, almost grateful, as though attending his daughter's wedding was the greatest privilege of his day. Richard remained convinced that the evening was still under his control. He had no idea that within the next few minutes the first person approaching Daniel would speak words capable of changing every assumption in the ballroom, beginning with his own. Harold reached Daniel first, stopping only a few feet away before extending both hands instead of one. His eyes shone with unmistakable respect. "Daniel," he said warmly, "I was beginning to think you would never leave your quiet little town long enough for us to see you again." Daniel smiled with genuine affection and accepted the greeting. "Good to see you too, Harold. I promised my daughter I would be here, and that is one promise I would never break." The words were simple, yet something about them caused the nearby conversations to disappear. Harold laughed softly. "You have always kept every promise that mattered." Before Daniel could answer, the elegant woman in the emerald dress stepped beside them. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice filled with gratitude, "my foundation still tells your story every year. We would not have survived without your guidance." Daniel looked almost embarrassed by the praise. "You built something wonderful," he replied. "I only pointed you toward the right people." She gently shook her head. "You always say that, but you know it is not true." The attorney from Chicago arrived moments later and smiled broadly. "I cannot believe I finally get to thank you in person. The scholarship program you created changed my life before I ever stepped into law school." Daniel placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "You earned every success yourself." The attorney answered without hesitation. "Only because you opened the first door." Richard watched the growing circle with visible confusion. None of the names meant anything unusual to him, yet the reactions did. These were accomplished professionals, people who rarely admired anyone publicly. Still, each of them spoke to Daniel with the same quiet reverence. Richard leaned toward one of his closest business partners. "Who exactly is this man?" The executive frowned. "I do not know, but I have never seen Harold Bennett greet anyone like that." Nearby reporters quickly redirected their cameras toward the unexpected gathering. A producer whispered into an earpiece, asking someone in the newsroom to search for information about Daniel Brooks. The results came back almost immediately. There was almost nothing to find. No interviews, no magazine covers, no social media accounts. The mystery only deepened. Naomi finally walked toward her father, and Daniel's expression softened even more. He handed her the small navy gift box with both hands. "Your mother wanted you to have this on your wedding day," he said quietly. Naomi accepted it carefully, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You kept it all these years." Daniel nodded. "Some gifts become more valuable when they are opened at the right moment." Ethan stood beside them, deeply moved by the quiet exchange. Daniel turned toward him with a warm smile and extended his hand. "Thank you for loving my daughter exactly as she is." Ethan accepted the handshake firmly. "The honor is mine, sir." Richard remained where he stood, still unwilling to approach. In his mind, none of this explained why respected leaders were treating Daniel like someone extraordinary. He convinced himself there had to be a simple explanation, perhaps an old friendship or a charitable connection. Yet across the ballroom, Margaret noticed something else entirely. More guests were beginning to recognize Daniel one by one. Some whispered his name with surprise. Others slowly stood from their tables before making their way toward him. The circle around Naomi's father continued to grow, and for the first time that evening, Richard Hawthorne felt something he had not expected to feel at his own son's wedding. He was no longer the most important man in the room. Richard forced a polite smile as he finally walked toward the growing circle around Daniel Brooks. The ballroom had shifted in a way he could not explain. Guests who had been eager to impress him only minutes earlier were now quietly waiting for an opportunity to greet the man he had dismissed before learning his name. Richard had spent decades reading boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar agreements, yet this room no longer responded to his presence. It responded to Daniel's. "Mr. Brooks," Richard said with measured courtesy, extending his hand, "I am Richard Hawthorne. Welcome." Daniel accepted the handshake with the same calm respect he had shown everyone else. "Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation, even if I arrived later than I hoped." Richard noticed the strength of the handshake, but also the complete absence of any desire to impress him. Daniel neither rushed the greeting nor lingered. He simply smiled and released his hand. Before Richard could continue, another voice interrupted from behind. "Daniel, I knew it was you." An elderly gentleman with a military bearing approached, followed closely by his wife. Daniel's face brightened. "General Wallace. It has been far too long." The retired general embraced him warmly. "You never came to a single ceremony where we tried to honor you." Daniel laughed softly. "That was never necessary." The general shook his head. "Necessary? Half the veterans in my foundation received scholarships, because you quietly funded them after they came home. You changed hundreds of families. A hush spread across the nearby guests. Richard slowly turned toward the general, wondering if he had heard correctly. Daniel answered almost immediately. The credit belongs to the teachers, the counselors, and the families who never gave up on them. The general smiled. You always redirect the praise. Nearby reporters began speaking into their headsets again. Producers searched every database they could access. Yet almost nothing appeared except scattered references to anonymous donations made over many years through different charitable organizations. The pattern became obvious. Someone had worked very hard to stay out of the spotlight. Ethan watched Daniel with growing admiration. He leaned toward Naomi and quietly asked, "You never told me any of this." Naomi looked at her father with gentle pride. "Because he would not have wanted me to. He always said that borrowed reputation disappears the moment you stop earning your own." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding her better than ever before. Richard overheard those words, and for the first time a small crack appeared in his certainty. Throughout his career, he had met many wealthy people. Almost all of them enjoyed discussing their achievements. Daniel seemed determined to avoid the subject whenever anyone mentioned it. Margaret observed Richard's expression changing little by little. She recognized the uncomfortable feeling that arrives when assumptions begin to fall apart. It rarely happened all at once. It happened one quiet truth at a time. Daniel turned toward Naomi again and gently adjusted a loose strand of hair away from her face, just as any loving father would. "Your mother would have been smiling from the front row tonight," he said softly. Naomi blinked away tears and answered, with a smile, "She is probably smiling anyway." Daniel nodded. "I believe she is." The orchestra resumed another gentle melody as the guests slowly returned to their seats, yet the atmosphere had completely transformed. The wedding was no longer about an unknown father arriving late. It had become a room full of accomplished people quietly honoring a man who had spent a lifetime helping others without asking for recognition. Standing only a few feet away, Richard Hawthorne realized he still did not know who Daniel Brooks truly was. But for the first time that evening, he was no longer certain that he wanted the answer because he was beginning to suspect it would reveal far more about himself than about the man standing before him. The wedding coordinator quietly stepped forward and asked whether the ceremony should begin, but no one answered immediately. The question seemed to drift unnoticed through the ballroom because every conversation had found its way back to Daniel Brooks. Richard glanced around the room and realized that even some of his oldest friends had become distracted by the unexpected guest. It unsettled him in ways he could not explain. He had built his life on understanding influence, yet influence did not usually arrive wearing worn boots and carrying a modest gift wrapped in plain paper. Daniel remained completely at ease. He accepted each greeting with the same warm smile, never lingering long enough to make himself the center of attention. Whenever someone praised him, he redirected the conversation toward the people around him. "Tell me about your grandchildren," he asked one guest. "How is your daughter enjoying medical school?" he asked another. People who had entered the ballroom expecting to discuss investments suddenly found themselves talking about family, purpose, and gratitude. Ethan watched the scene unfold with growing admiration. "He makes everyone feel important," he quietly said. Naomi smiled. "That is because he believes they already are." Richard overheard the exchange and folded his arms more tightly. He still searched for a logical explanation. Successful people often cultivated charm, but Daniel's kindness felt entirely unpracticed. There was no performance behind it, only habit. Across the ballroom, one of the reporters finally received a call from the newsroom. Her expression changed instantly. She lowered her microphone and whispered to the cameraman, "Do not broadcast this yet. I need confirmation." The cameraman frowned. What did they find? She looked toward Daniel before answering. "Almost nothing. That is the strange part. Every major donation was made through independent trusts. Every public recognition was declined. Every award ceremony lists the same response. He never attended." The cameraman blinked. "Someone spent decades avoiding publicity?" She slowly nodded. "Apparently." Nearby, Harold Bennett happened to overhear the conversation. He smiled gently and said, "You are looking in the wrong places. Daniel never invested in headlines. He invested in people." The reporter turned toward him. "You have known him for a long time?" Harold answered without hesitation. long enough to know that half the people thanking him tonight have no idea how many others he helped without ever meeting them. Richard caught only part of the conversation, but each sentence chipped away at the image he had formed of Naomi's family. He looked toward the blue pickup truck still visible through the rain-speckled windows. For the first time, it occurred to him that perhaps the truck was not evidence of poverty at all. Perhaps it was simply a choice. Daniel noticed Richard standing alone and walked over with quiet courtesy. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, "I hope my late arrival did not create unnecessary stress for your family. A highway closure delayed me longer than expected." Richard studied his face carefully. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify himself beyond a simple explanation. "These things happen," Richard replied politely. Daniel smiled. "Thank you for understanding." Before either man could continue, the ballroom doors opened once again. A distinguished woman in a Navy business suit entered briskly, carrying a leather portfolio. Several executives recognized her immediately and exchanged surprised glances. She looked across the room until she found Daniel, then walked directly toward him with visible relief. "Mr. Brooks," she said respectfully, "I am so glad I made it before the ceremony. The board insisted I deliver this to you personally." As she extended the portfolio with both hands, a ripple of astonishment spread through the guests who recognized not only the woman, but the global organization she represented. The woman in the Navy business suit stopped in front of Daniel and offered the leather portfolio with both hands, waiting patiently until he accepted it. "Thank you for coming all this way," Daniel said with quiet sincerity. "You should have stayed with your family this weekend." She smiled warmly. "The board would not hear of it. They insisted this could only be delivered to you in person." Daniel gave a small, almost amused shake of his head. "They always make too much of these things." She laughed softly. "That is exactly what I told them you would say." Curious whispers spread from table to table. Richard studied the woman carefully before recognition struck him. He had seen her only once before at an international leadership conference. She was the executive director of one of the largest educational foundations in the country, an organization that partnered with universities, Fortune 500 companies, and government agencies. Richard had spent months trying to arrange a meeting with their board several years earlier without success. Yet here she stood, speaking to Daniel with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Brooks," she continued, "the trustees voted unanimously last week. They have named the new National Scholarship Initiative in your honor." Daniel immediately looked uncomfortable. "I asked them not to do that." "We know," she replied with a smile. "That is why they waited until the vote was final before telling you." Several nearby guests exchanged stunned glances. The reporter who had been searching for answers lowered her microphone again, listening carefully to every word. Daniel opened the portfolio only far enough to glance at the first page before quietly closing it again. "Please thank everyone for their kindness," he said. "But remember that thousands of volunteers made that work possible. Their names deserve to be remembered just as much as mine." The executive director nodded. "That is exactly why they chose you." Ethan watched the exchange with growing admiration. Naomi leaned toward him and whispered, "When I was little, I thought every father spent weekends visiting schools and community centers." Ethan smiled gently. "You never realized it was unusual." Naomi shook her head. "Not until I was much older." Richard remained silent, but inside his certainty continued to erode. He had measured success by visibility, influence, and recognition. Daniel appeared to have achieved extraordinary respect by deliberately avoiding all three. Harold Bennett stepped beside Richard and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "You know what impressed me the first time I met Daniel?" Richard slowly shook his head. Harold smiled. He remembered the names of every maintenance worker in our building before he remembered the names of the executives. Richard glanced toward Daniel just in time to see him thanking a server for refilling a water glass. The young employee smiled as though he had just received the greatest compliment of the evening. Daniel treated him with exactly the same warmth he had shown the retired general, the attorney, and the executive director. There was no difference. Margaret noticed Richard watching the scene with thoughtful eyes. She had waited all evening for this moment. Pride rarely disappeared in an instant. It softened one realization at a time. The orchestra quietly adjusted their music as guests gradually returned to their seats, but the atmosphere had changed beyond recognition. The wedding was no longer defined by wealth or social standing. It had become a quiet lesson in the kind of influence that could not be purchased. As Daniel slipped the unopened portfolio beneath his arm beside the simple navy gift box, Richard found himself asking a question he had never expected to ask about the father of the woman he had judged so quickly. If this man had spent his entire life refusing recognition, what remarkable truth had still not been revealed to everyone in the room? The quiet anticipation inside the ballroom grew almost tangible as guests settled back into their seats, yet no one seemed ready to let the evening continue. Too many questions remained unanswered. Richard Hawthorne glanced toward the wedding coordinator, who politely waited for instructions, then back toward Daniel Brooks, who stood speaking with Naomi and Ethan as though the entire room had disappeared. The contrast unsettled him. Most people became self-conscious when dozens of strangers watched them. Daniel seemed completely unaware of the attention because his focus never drifted far from his daughter. Naomi carefully opened the small navy gift box her father had carried into the ballroom. Inside rested a simple silver locket with delicate hand engraving around its edges. She drew a slow breath before opening it. On one side was a photograph of her mother smiling beneath an old oak tree. On the other was a folded handwritten note. Naomi read the first line silently before tears gathered gently in her eyes. Daniel noticed and smiled. "She wrote that the week before our anniversary," he said softly. "She wanted you to read it on the happiest day of your life." Naomi closed the locket against her heart for a moment before embracing her father. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that some moments deserved to be remembered instead of interrupted. Ethan watched them with quiet admiration. He had always known Naomi came from a loving home, but only now did he fully understand the depth of that love. It had never depended on money, status, or recognition. It had been built through years of promises quietly kept. Richard observed the embrace from across the room, and something inside him shifted again. He remembered his own late wife often reminding him that business meetings could wait, but family moments could not. Too many times he had chosen the meeting anyway. Harold Bennett slowly approached Richard once more. "You are wondering why so many people know Daniel," he said. Richard gave a small nod. Harold smiled thoughtfully. "Because whenever someone needed help, he never asked whether they could repay him. He only asked what they needed to become." Richard looked toward Daniel with growing curiosity. "Was he in education?" Harold chuckled. "Among other things." Before he could explain further, the executive director returned carrying a second folder. "Forgive me," she said to Daniel. "There is one more item the trustees asked me to mention personally." Daniel sighed with gentle amusement. "You are making this much more complicated than it needs to be." She smiled. "Perhaps, but the truth belongs to everyone who has benefited from your work." Turning toward Naomi, she said warmly, "Your father insisted that every scholarship recipient remain anonymous to one another so that no one would ever feel indebted. Over the last 30 years, more than 40,000 students have graduated because of programs he quietly funded." Soft gasps spread across the ballroom. The number echoed through the room more powerfully than any applause could have. Daniel immediately lifted a hand with humble embarrassment. "Please remember that thousands of teachers, donors, and volunteers made those opportunities possible." The executive director gently shook her head. "They all say the same thing. Without you, none of them would have started." Richard felt his heartbeat quicken. 40,000 lives. Countless families. Entire communities shaped by a man he had mistaken for someone insignificant because of an old pickup truck and an ordinary jacket. Yet an even deeper mystery remained. If Daniel had quietly influenced so many people while refusing every public honor, Richard could not help wondering what else he had failed to see. Somewhere in the back of his memory, the name Daniel Brooks began to stir with a strange familiarity, as though it belonged to a chapter of his own life that he had somehow forgotten. Richard remained motionless as the conversations around him blurred into an indistinct murmur. The ballroom lights still shimmered across polished marble, the orchestra still played softly in the background, and guests still admired the quiet dignity of Daniel Brooks. Yet Richard no longer heard any of it clearly. His thoughts had become trapped inside a memory that refused to remain hidden. The name, Daniel Brooks. He had heard it. Before. Not in newspapers. Not on television. Somewhere much closer. Somewhere that had altered the course of his own life. He closed his eyes for only a moment, searching through decades of board meetings, contracts, and difficult years. Then the memory returned with startling clarity. 23 years earlier, Hawthorne Technologies had stood on the edge of collapse after an economic downturn forced several major investors to withdraw within the same month. Banks had refused additional financing. Employees feared layoffs. Richard had spent endless nights believing everything he had built was about to disappear. One afternoon, his attorney had walked into the office carrying a single folder. "A private educational trust has agreed to purchase the debt," he had announced. Richard remembered asking who was behind the trust, but the answer had been brief. Anonymous donors. The agreement required complete confidentiality. Hawthorne Technologies had survived. Within 3 years, the company recovered and eventually became one of the country's most respected firms. Richard had often described that investment as the miracle that saved his business. Yet he had never learned who made it possible. His breathing slowed as another forgotten detail surfaced. The trust had carried 3 initials on the paperwork. DB. He slowly lifted his eyes toward Daniel, who was laughing quietly after one of the younger servers accidentally apologized for interrupting a conversation. Daniel simply thanked him for his hard work and wished him an enjoyable evening. There was not the slightest trace of superiority in his voice. Richard felt an unfamiliar weight settle across his shoulders. Michael Carter, the Hawthorne family attorney, quietly approached after receiving an urgent message on his phone. He glanced toward Daniel before speaking softly. "Richard, I believe I have identified the educational trust from the old restructuring documents." Richard turned toward him almost immediately. "Tell me." Michael hesitated. The trust was established by Daniel Brooks over 30 years ago. It was designed to invest in companies that protected jobs, supported local communities, and maintained educational partnerships. The trustees were instructed never to reveal his involvement unless he personally approved it. Richard stared at him without speaking. Michael continued carefully. "Your company was one of those investments." Silence settled between them. Richard slowly looked across the ballroom once again. Daniel had never mentioned it. Not when they shook hands. Not when they spoke. Not even after Richard questioned Naomi's family in front of everyone. The realization struck with overwhelming force. The man he had publicly judged, the father he had quietly dismissed because of ordinary clothes and an old pickup truck, had once saved the future of Hawthorne Technologies without asking for recognition, repayment, or gratitude. Richard felt his throat tighten. Around him, the ballroom remained filled with warm conversation and joyful anticipation, yet everything inside him had changed. For the first time in decades, he realized that the foundation beneath his own success had been built, in part, by the quiet generosity of the very man he had failed to recognize. Richard stood silently for several long moments after Michael Carter stepped away. The attorney had spoken only a handful of sentences, yet those few words had dismantled years of certainty. Around him, the ballroom glowed with warm light and quiet celebration, but inside his heart a different scene unfolded. He remembered the sleepless nights when Hawthorne Technologies had nearly failed. He remembered reassuring frightened employees that he would find a solution even when he had no idea where one would come from. He remembered the anonymous trust that had preserved hundreds of jobs, protected families, and given his company another chance to survive. For more than 2 decades, he had privately thanked fortune for that unexpected rescue. Never once had he imagined the man responsible would someday walk through the doors of his own family celebration, carrying nothing more than a modest gift for his daughter. Richard slowly crossed the ballroom toward Daniel. Guests instinctively stepped aside, sensing that something important was about to happen. Daniel had just finished congratulating a young teacher who had once received one of his scholarships when he noticed Richard approaching. He greeted him with the same calm smile as before. "Mr. Hawthorne," Daniel said warmly, "I hope we still have time for your son and my daughter to enjoy the wedding they have waited so long for." Richard looked into Daniel's eyes, searching for even the smallest trace of resentment. He found none. "There is something I need to ask you," Richard said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Of course." Richard lowered his voice. "Years ago, an educational trust invested in my company when no one else would. Was that your trust?" Daniel paused only briefly before answering. "Yes. Our trustees believed your company supported good people and created opportunities for families. We hoped it would recover." Richard stared at him. "You knew it was my company?" Daniel smiled gently. "Yes. Then why did you never tell me? Daniel looked around the ballroom for a moment before answering. Because helping someone should never become a debt they are forced to carry. If kindness expects recognition, it becomes a transaction instead of a gift. Richard felt every word settle deeply within him. Tonight, I questioned your family in front of everyone. Daniel remained completely composed. You question what you believe to be true. We all make judgments before we know the full story. The important question is what we choose after the truth arrives. Richard lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time in many years, he found no argument, no explanation, and no defense worth offering. Nearby, Naomi watched the conversation unfold with quiet emotion. She had heard her father repeat those same lessons throughout her childhood. Character mattered more than appearances. Humility outlasted applause. Generosity was most powerful when no one knew who had given it. Ethan gently took Naomi's hand. Neither of them interrupted. This was not a conversation that belonged to the younger generation alone. It belonged to two fathers whose choices would shape their family for years to come. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. Your attorney returned this to me after the restructuring was complete, he said. Richard accepted it carefully. It was a copy of the original agreement bearing the signatures that had saved Hawthorne Technologies decades earlier. At the bottom, beneath every legal clause, Daniel had handwritten a single sentence that Richard had never seen because it remained inside the confidential file. It read, "When people are given another chance, may they someday become someone else's second chance." Richard's hands trembled slightly as he read those words, and at that moment he understood that the greatest investment Daniel Brooks had ever made was never in companies. It had always been in people. The words on the faded agreement remained in Richard Hawthorne's hands long after he finished reading them. Around him the ballroom seemed quieter than it had all evening, not because the music had stopped, but because every conversation had gradually given way to quiet observation. Guests who had arrived expecting an elegant wedding now found themselves witnessing something far more meaningful. Richard carefully folded the document and looked at Daniel Brooks with eyes that no longer carried pride. They carried gratitude, regret, and the unmistakable weight of understanding. He took one slow step forward before speaking clearly enough for those nearby to hear. Daniel, I owe you far more than I ever knew. Daniel gently shook his head. No, Richard. You owe your employees for believing in your company, your family for standing beside you, and yourself for continuing when it would have been easier to quit. Our trust only opened one door. You walked through it. Richard lowered his head for a brief moment. That is generous of you, but it does not erase what happened tonight. Daniel remained silent, allowing him to continue. Richard slowly turned toward Naomi. Every memory of the evening replayed inside his mind with painful clarity. He remembered questioning her worth before learning her story. He remembered assuming that simple clothes and quiet manners revealed a simple life. He remembered speaking about legacy while standing in front of a woman whose family had quietly created opportunities for tens of thousands of strangers without asking for applause. He walked toward Naomi until they stood only a few feet apart. Ethan remained beside her, gently holding her hand, but neither of them interrupted. Richard drew a careful breath. Naomi, I judged you before I knew you. I looked at appearances instead of character. I believed success could be measured by wealth that people could see instead of kindness that people could feel. I was wrong. The ballroom fell completely silent. Richard continued, his voice steady but sincere. I embarrassed you on a day that should have been filled only with joy. For that, I am deeply sorry. Naomi looked toward her father before answering. Daniel gave only a small encouraging nod. She turned back to Richard with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the evening. An apology has meaning when it changes the future, not only the past. Richard slowly nodded. I intend for it to do both. Daniel stepped closer, his expression warm rather than triumphant. Richard, every family begins with imperfect people learning how to love one another better than they did yesterday. That is all any of us can hope for. Margaret smiled quietly from across the ballroom, recognizing the truth she had waited all evening to hear spoken aloud. The executive director, Harold Bennett, General Wallace, and countless other guests exchanged gentle smiles of agreement. None of them applauded. Some moments were too personal for applause. Ethan looked at his father with emotion shining in his eyes. He had admired Richard for building an extraordinary company. Tonight he admired him for something far more difficult. He had chosen humility when pride would have been easier. Richard then faced both Naomi and Ethan together. "If you are willing," he said softly, "I would like to begin again. Not as a businessman protecting a family name, but as a father welcoming his daughter." Naomi's eyes filled with quiet tears as she smiled. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and embraced him gently. Richard closed his eyes, understanding that no financial success, no corporate victory, and no public recognition had ever felt as meaningful as earning the chance to become worthy of the family standing beside him. The wedding ceremony finally began beneath the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers, yet everyone present understood they had witnessed something far more enduring than an exchange of vows. The atmosphere that had once been filled with quiet judgment had become one of gratitude, reflection, and hope. As Naomi and Ethan stood together before their family and friends, the smile surrounding them carried a different meaning than they had only an hour earlier. They were no longer celebrating the joining of two successful families. They were celebrating the triumph of character over appearance, humility over pride, and compassion over assumption. Richard Hawthorne remained seated in the front row, his hands folded calmly in his lap as he watched his son and his new daughter begin their life together. Several times his eyes drifted toward Daniel Brooks, who stood quietly near the back beside Margaret, intentionally allowing the young couple to remain the center of attention. That simple decision reflected everything Richard had finally come to understand. Daniel had never entered a room hoping to be noticed. He entered hoping someone else would leave it stronger than before. As the ceremony concluded, guests rose together in joyful applause. The sound echoed through the ballroom with warmth instead of spectacle. Naomi and Ethan walked back down the aisle hand in hand, while friends and family surrounded them with laughter, congratulations, and heartfelt embraces. Richard waited until the crowd settled before walking toward Daniel once more. This time there was no hesitation in his steps. He extended his hand, then gently withdrew it, and instead embraced Daniel as an old friend. Daniel smiled warmly and returned the embrace without a word. Sometimes forgiveness required no speech at all. "There is one thing I would like to ask," Richard said quietly after they stepped apart. Daniel looked at him with patient curiosity. "Anything?" Richard smiled, a smile softer than anyone in the ballroom had ever seen from him. "I hope this will not be the last family celebration we share together." Daniel laughed gently. "I have a feeling it will. Only be the first of many." Nearby, Naomi watched the exchange with grateful eyes. She reached into her pocket and touched the silver locket her father had given her. Inside remained her mother's handwritten message, reminding her that kindness would always outlive wealth, titles, and recognition. Looking around the ballroom, she realized those words had become true before her eyes. The richest person in the room had not been measured by the size of a bank account or the value of a company. Real wealth had revealed itself through decades of quiet generosity, promises faithfully kept, and lives transformed without expectation of reward. As the evening drew to a close, guests slowly departed beneath clear skies where the rain had completely disappeared. The blue pickup truck remained parked beside rows of luxury automobiles, yet no one looked at it the same way anymore. It had become a quiet reminder that dignity could never be identified by possessions alone. Richard stood beside Daniel as the newlyweds prepared to leave. He glanced toward the truck and smiled. "I spent years believing legacy was something people inherited." Daniel followed his gaze before answering. "Legacy is not what we leave behind. It is what we leave inside other people." Richard nodded thoughtfully. He looked toward Naomi and Ethan, then toward the employees thanking guests at the entrance, and finally toward the families leaving with hopeful hearts. In that single moment, he understood the difference between building an empire and building a life. One could be counted in dollars. The other could only be measured by the number of people who became kinder because they had crossed your path. Long after the lights inside the ballroom faded and the final guests returned home, the memory they carried was not of elegant decorations, expensive suits, or remarkable success. They remembered a father who arrived in an old pickup truck, carrying a simple gift, and quietly reminded an entire room that the greatest fortune any person can possess is a heart that continues giving long after the world has stopped watching.